A tale of time. How have people kept track of time over the ages? Who decided to divide each day into 24 hours? When were clocks invented? As you go about your day, how do you know that time is passing? Ancient people noted time passing by watching the movement of the sun. It rises, it arcs in the sky, it sets, there is darkness, and then the cycle repeats, with each cycle representing another day. Archaeological evidence indicates that 5,000 years ago in Egypt and Babylon, people kept track of time with year-long calendars. They used these calendars to coordinate planting and harvesting crops, to plan public events, and to plan travel for trade. The Egyptians divided sunlight hours into 10 periods, or hours, plus 2 twilight periods for the rising and setting of the sun. Today, we still have 12 daylight hours. Ancient Egyptians also followed shadows on sundials to track daylight hours. But here's the tricky part. The length of the day changes throughout the year. That is, there is a longer period of daylight during summer than there is in winter, and as a result, the length of the hours also changes. Of course, sundials don't work very well without the sun. So people created devices that could record the passage of time at night too. It seemed logical to divide the night into 12 hours as well. The water clock, created in ancient China, is one device that worked regardless of the time of day. Water clocks measure the changing water level that flows from one container to another. Just like a modern stopwatch, early water clocks were used to keep track of the time during speeches, trials, and public events. But as you may have already guessed, water clocks don't do very well in climates with freezing temperatures. It wasn't until the 1200s CE that Europeans built mechanical clocks by using weights and gears to measure time. These enormous devices were installed in public buildings and churches and had to be heard by entire towns. But they had to be adjusted manually to make up for the changing length of the hour throughout the year, and it was not an easy task. In the 1300s, people decided to divide the day into 24 equal hours, no matter the day or time of year. So when did the 24-hour day begin? Ancient Babylonians and Egyptians started the day at sunrise. But 14th century Italians chose to start the 24 hours at sunset. Astronomers started it at midday, while German communities preferred starting it at midnight. Eventually, the world settled on splitting the day into 2 12-hour periods, beginning at midnight. Think about the connection between the numbers 1 through 12 on a clock and the 24 hours in the day. Notice that the 12 hours on the clock represent both the 12 hours in the first half of the day and the 12 hours in the second half of the day. The hours before noon are called AM for short, for ante meridium, meaning before midday or before noon. And the hours after noon are called PM, which stand for post-meridium, meaning after midday or afternoon. The first half of the day starts just past midnight at 12:01 a.m., and the second half of the day starts just past noon at 12:01 p.m. Still, mechanical clocks were large and were not convenient or affordable to have at home. Everyday folks had to keep track of time with devices such as candle clocks. The slow-burning candles in these clocks, known to burn at a steady rate, showed how much time had passed as the wax melted. In the 1400s, clockmakers began using coiled springs to regulate timepieces, and they were able to make clocks small enough for people to have in their homes, but they weren't yet reliably accurate. It wasn't until 1656 that Dutch physicist and mathematician Christiaan Huygens invented the swinging pendulum clock. Huygens' clock was accurate to within 10 seconds per day, the most accurate clock of its time. It helped Huygens maintain accurate time for his scientific work in astronomy, and it was small enough to use in homes. Spring-coiled clocks did not disappear, and eventually they were made to be reliable enough and small enough to use as pocket watches. In 1751, a young scholar named Benjamin Banneker saw a spring-coiled clock and was inspired. Banneker was an inventor, astronomer, writer, and anti-slavery advocate. He was born a free man in Maryland during the time when slavery was prevalent in the United States. As an African American, Banneker did not have the same freedoms and opportunities as white Americans had, even though he was not born into slavery. Banneker had little formal education, but he was brilliant and eager to learn. When he was 20 years old, he became fascinated with the family friend's pocket watch. To better understand how it worked, he took it apart and put it back together many times. Banneker spent the next 2 years creating a wooden clock based on the pocket watch. The clock was completed in 1753 and kept an accurate time until it was destroyed in a fire in 1806. Many historians believe Banneker was the first portable clock made entirely in the United States. Although most of Banneker's work was also lost in the fire, he published 6 almanacs during his lifetime, and they remain today. In the almanacs, Banneker tracked time in a different way. He predicted seasonal changes, solar eclipses, and rainfall to help farmers yield the best crops. Today, clocks come in all shapes and sizes. There is a wide variety of high-tech ways to keep track of time. The optical clock, which is based on lasers, is expected to tell the exact time for the next 13.7 billion years. It ticks a quadrillion times per second. The modern analog clock has 3 hands. One hand marks the hour, another hand marks the minute, and a third hand marks the second. Each hour is divided into 60 minutes, and each minute into 60 seconds. The longest hand on the clock points to the seconds, and the shortest hand points to the hours. In other words, the shortest hand marks the longest amount of time, and the longest hand marks the shortest amount of time. Of course, these are not actual hands, but they do point to the time as a hand would. Could that be why they're called hands? The tick marks on the face of an analog clock that represents the seconds and minutes are the smallest marks on the clock, so it is easier to locate them using the longer hand. Similarly, the tick marks that represent the hours are the biggest and boldest, so they can be found using a shorter hand. Do you think there may be a connection between the tick marks and the ticking sound clocks often make? Digital clocks do not use hands to mark the time. They simply show the count of hours, minutes, and sometimes seconds. Military time counts hours from 1 to 24, and not as 2 sets from 1 to 12, labeled AM and PM. For example, here we see 14:18. Can you tell what time it is? Why might military time use the numbers from 1 to 24? Thanks to inventors throughout history, we can keep track of time in meaningful and useful ways. In fact, the oldest working clock in the world, the Salisbury Cathedral clock in England, was built in the late 1300s. It has ticked more than 500 million times. Now that is a long time.